Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy. Now, this is a really unusual podcast this time because I spoke to my guest before the coronavirus lockdown in February, but chaos and illness and pandemic took over and the podcast came off the air for a while. As you know, we are back, but we felt our conversation had been rather overtaken by a few different things. So we thought we'd play some of that conversation and then have a new one. So let's begin with my old introduction, and you can discover who it is. And my guest today has got a very varied life. In fact, varied names as well. Amrou Al-Kadhi.
That's it.
Welcome.
Hello.
Is also known as Glamrou.
Yeah, Glamrou Al-Khalifa Al-Hayati Ladanim.
And you're here as Glamrou.
Yes, I'm here as
so should I
Glamrou.
call you Glamrou?
Yes, please.
Okay, good.
Or Her Majesty.
And so, I mean, you know, your world has been turned upside down
Yes.
by you just being yourself.
It has been. Yeah, the struggle to just be true to yourself has had a lot of hurdles. But I actually think those hurdles have sort of got me to where I want to be. So I'm oddly grateful for how difficult it's been, if that makes any sense.
Now you can describe yourself as a writer. You've got a book out of your life story, a performer, as a drag queen, and a filmmaker as well.
Yes, yeah.
Because you've got fiction on the Apple platform.
Yeah, it's a TV show called Little America, which is on Apple TV Plus, and each episode is about a different immigrant's experience in America. And I co-wrote the episode about a queer Syrian trying to make it in America.
But all of these things that you do, they have a mission, don't they?
Definitely. Like, I don't think I would ever be able to create work which didn't try and advance something politically, because the world is so in peril right now, and I'm so privileged compared to a lot of queer Iraqis who I know who are still in Iraq and aren't able to just express themselves in the most kind of minute of levels. I would feel like I was doing a great disservice to our community if I was given, let's say, the Apple platform and just did something that didn't try and change the conversation. I kind of think it's like my duty to just try and provide counter narratives all the time, because there are so many dominant narratives that are harmful about Arabs and Muslims and queer people and trans people, especially in Britain right now.
So, well, having said all of that, let's go back to the beginning. So where did you grow up?
So I was in my mummy's tummy with my twin brother when they were in Iraq under Saddam, and then they came to the UK. We were born, got a British passport. Theresa May was not in the Home Office yet. And then we moved back to the Middle East, Dubai for a few years, and then Bahrain, just following my dad's work.
So you grew up there?
Yeah, I grew up in the Middle East. And it was very happy for a while, because what the Middle East has that I have found the West doesn't is family-focused collectivity. And the care for the elderly is something that really shocked me when I came to the UK when I was like 13, 14, because like the older you get in the Middle East, the more revered you are by your family. Like when my grandmother used to come to like a meal, it was like an event. We had to give her the big seat and all fawn over her. So this, like, when I realized that people just get like put in nursing homes here, I was like, wait, what? That was a big surprise for me. Constant family, to the point of it being a bit like, oh my God, give me some space. But like, feasting every day and constantly that kind of sense of community, that was all great until I was about 7. And then it was just very obvious to everyone that I was a nonconformist.
How?
I just asked too many questions, I think, like of my Islam teacher, like, just said.
Because what age do you start having Islam classes?
For me, it was about 7. And, it started off for me as being really great. Like, you have this person, Allah, who loves you unconditionally. Wow, that's so great. I'm so lucky, and there was all that. And I really did feel a lot of that. And then from about 7-ish on, I think it was very particular to my experience, just the school that I was at. But I had this very strict Islam teacher who from the age of 7 was saying, she made us close our eyes every week and imagine this scenario where you're lying in your grave, it's Judgment Day, it rips open, your corpse goes all the way up to purgatory.
Oh my God.
I know, so freaking Tim Burton, like it's a joke. And then Allah weighs all your sins and good deeds on a scale in front of everybody you know, who will hear everything you've ever said about them and thought about them. And then if you have one extra sin over a good point, that's an extra lifetime in hell. And we literally were taught to visualize hell. So it was like eating fruits that were actually devil heads that would then rip up your intestines. And this was age 7, 8. I mean, this was constant. And then I developed like extreme OCD. So for me, because like the
OCD about what?
Because I had so many sins on my left shoulder. Because I just knew, I was like, I'm thinking, because it was like Allah could punish your thoughts if you questioned him, or if you thought anything that was potentially transgressive. So my thing was, okay, if I get 100% in absolutely every piece of schoolwork, I'll prove to Allah that I'm not a sinner. So for me, it became to the point of it, like 99% would throw up. I would literally throw up on the floor. I'd be like, this is the worst day of my life. I had to proofread every piece of homework 32 times. I then was so scared that I actually developed this tic, which was basically as a way to stop myself sinning. I would say, I did this first aid course when I was 11, and you learn this acronym called Dr. ABC, which means like danger, response, airway, breathing, circulation. And all day long in my head, I would just say DRABC, DRABC, as a way to stop myself thinking anything negative. And when anyone talked, so if you were like, hey, Amrou, I'd be like, DRA, hey, Amrou, DRA, so you'd be A. And then I'd be like, okay, yeah, Krishnan's an A+. And then I'd be like, okay, that person just said, go home, so they're an R. And I would just do this all day, every day. And I think my parents were like, what is going on with my 11-year-old? And that has had many deficits into my mental health.
So when did you verbalize your sexuality with your parents?
Well, they found out because they found a porn DVD, and my mum couldn't look at me for a really, really long time.
When?
That was like 15. They also found out I lied to go see Brokeback Mountain when I was 14. And that caused a huge, I got grounded for a very long time.
So where are we by this stage?
I'm in London. So
we're in Britain by this stage.
I came to London when I'm 11. I'm still Muslim, and then I go to a British school, start doing very well academically, and then I came out to my parents as white, actually, in a kind of like, great, I'm in Britain now, piss off the Middle East. It's caused me so much trauma. And my parents were just so upset that I was like rejecting my heritage. And I said, I'm no longer Muslim. People were fasting and I would eat in front of them. I was like a brat. I was clearly acting out something, but I was not a nice kid, I don't think. And then
what were you rejecting?
So in my head, I thought definitely.
Were you just being a rebellious kid?
No.
Or were you rejecting all this hellfire? And
for me, I just thought, right, I'm definitely gay. And all the people that I could see around me that were different, I thought, I'm much more like you. That's incompatible with what I learned in the Middle East. Therefore, the Middle East is out of my life. Like in that really childish binary way. That's the way I approached it. So I went to an acting school every weekend and made myself go to the speech therapy classes so I could posh my accent up. I quit speaking Arabic in the house and learned French instead, and would just respond to anything my parents said in French. Kind of really try to assimilate into the West in a way. It was also complicated because it was around 2003 that this was happening, and my parents' family were all in Iraq. So they had a lot of anti-UK sentiment in the house. Because we had to go on the phone to our grandma. We could literally hear the bombs. Like, she's like, I don't know if we're going to survive. They actually had to escape and go to Dubai. So for my parents, their childhood houses were just being bombed. So they're now in the UK for work, but I think they became quite territorial about being Iraqi, and there was just so much anti-Blair, anti-British government. I'm not erudite at all politically at this point. So I just was like, I'm on the winning side, I guess, and I'm not going to think about it, and I'm not going to talk about it.
So you were pro-war?
I wasn't
in an anti-war family?
I wasn't pro-war, but I just wouldn't allow myself. I felt bad because I saw my mum crying every night, watching the news to see who else does she know might have died. But I just thought it was just difficult because I emotionally felt really upset that this was happening to Iraq. But in my head was like, well, but I'm not Iraqi anymore because I live in the West and this is the place that's going to liberate me. So I'm just not going to engage with it at all. This is all changed, by the way, to any listeners or viewers. Like, I'm very anti the Iraq War. My God, I think it's ruined. I actually think it's responsible for everything we're in now. But at the time, I just felt so much that my queer identity was going to be killed, like, either in hell, or I'm going to get kicked out by my parents, or I'm going to get shot. This is what I'd heard. So I just thought, that's the thing I've got to save. And then I applied. I was so keen to get out of the house, which was getting so traumatic. I, without telling my parents, applied for a scholarship to Eton College because I was like, just wanted to be a Harry Potter and enter like the British establishment. And I went there for 2 years and it was horrible.
So how did you become a drag queen?
I feel like I've always been one. Like in the Middle East, whenever my mum was out, I would just put on her makeup and her clothes and just, because my mum is a drag queen. She is the most camp and melodramatic person I've ever known. She's very strict, but she says things like, I mean, we were once going on an EasyJet flight and they wouldn't let her in with 4 suitcases. And I told her only to bring one. And in front of the whole of Heathrow, she screamed, "This is not EasyJet. This is difficult jet." And you know, and she once didn't have her dress broke for a wedding and she had to hire a welder to fix her into it. I mean, like, so I was always obsessed with that kind of performance of femininity, especially in the Middle East, because men do one thing, women do another. And I just wanted to do whatever the women were doing. So I think early on, I just was like, I want to do that. And then at Eton, I was always asked to play the leading lady because there was nobody else. And I was, you know.
You wanted to?
I desperately wanted to. That was quite interesting because I was so bullied at Eton, but because on stage, I was so good at it and was so funny and just free. It was almost like, well, we can't make fun of this because they're really in charge of it. Whereas like, you know, it's only when it looks like you're trying to hide it that people capitalize on it. But on stage, it was like, I'm going to make you all laugh. And so then when I got to Cambridge, I didn't have any, like, there wasn't a drag queen I was following and RuPaul wasn't around then or anything like that. So I remember just saying to like friends, I really want to get in drag, went on eBay, used my student loan to buy, which I still need to pay off, rented out a cellar and just told everyone to come in drag, invited some friends to perform with me, and we did a drag show. I use the term lightly. We all just kind of hovered around a microphone and basically cried and were like, this is who I am. It was all very sort of GCSE, I have to say. But yeah, as of that moment, it was just like the power I felt of like, oh my God, my femininity is the thing that's best about me. And I couldn't believe how powerful I felt. But what was happening was like my drag alter ego was so kind of empowered. And then my personal life was like getting worse and worse. Because once images of me in drag were circulated around the family and got back to the Middle East and was losing my dad clients and that kind of stuff, it was like, you know, things really hit the fan. And I was getting abusive messages from relatives, you know, saying, you know, you're the source of our life's unhappiness and all that. But then like in drag, it was like, I'm really sorted in drag. And I found that schizophrenia like very bizarre. And I met a costume designer, a stylist, an Arab stylist. She called herself a runaway Arab. And she was like, you know, I think, she was like, you look great in drag, but she was like, I think you could look to the Middle East a little bit more because there's some really draggy stuff there. And I was like, I just don't think there is. Like, and after a lot of therapy, I kind of confronted my parents and just said, you did all this stuff to me. It was horrific. Will you admit it? And they never really admitted it. But my mum was the major villain in my head because my dad was always quite silent and my mum was the one saying all the horrible stuff. So in my head, I just thought she's the villain. But when we really kind of thrashed it out, I kind of read between the lines and she said something similar to F you, basically, because I'm a woman and men give me such shit. I don't have my own money. I have to do what your dad says, blah, 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 blah. And 3 nights a week, you are a woman and you find it liberating. And that surprised me because it was like, oh, I think you're actually quite jealous of the freedom that I have. I mean, it's come with a price, but like, I think that was the first time when I realized my mum was her own person without me. You know, she has her own story that has nothing to do with me. And her story is, I've just socially reproduced whatever my parents said. They all socially reproduce, really, in our communities. Your kids tend to do what your parents did. You don't question it. It's a real taboo in our community to ever really question your parents. I think from why she had such a visceral antagonism towards me was less her like belief system, because she's not that strict in terms of her religious beliefs, but I think I was like a projection of everything she didn't get to do. And so when I realized that, I kind of forgave her in my head, and I thought, well, I'm going to start dressing up as you. And now my drag is almost like rescuing an image of her that I had as a kid, in a way, or being the woman she never got to be because she had to live life by the book. So when that happened, it was like, okay, wow, I'm really actually connecting to, I felt a lot, like now I don't feel a juxtaposition when I'm in drag or out of drag.
But do you think there is such a thing as normal?
No.
Or majority?
There's majority, because I know that, because they make life so hard for the minorities. I always take people, okay, this is going to sound a bit wacky, but quantum physics is this incredible sect of physics, which basically, with like Newtonian physics, I think of it as like heteronormative physics, where it's basically like, what are the fixed universal principles that govern the world? If I do A, will B happen? What are the formulas that'll tell us anywhere in the universe what will happen if I input this? Quantum physics is equally a real sect of physics that basically looks at subatomic particles, so the very smallest things in our universe, not like the macro things. And they contradict basically everything that Newtonian physics shows us. So most famous experiment is the double slit experiment, where you fire an electron and it should go through the left or right hole. And then every now and then it goes through both at the same time, and we don't really know why. And subatomic particles are sometimes the same subatomic particle is in different locations at the same times. And quantum physics shows that actually reality itself is basically a majority approximation of what's happening subatomically. So when people spew the biological essentialism argument on me, like, particles themselves are non-binary and do things that contradict each other all the time. We just can't see them all the time. And that gives me a lot of comfort that, like, if subatomic particles defy constructs all the time, why should we believe in fixed constructs of gender or any kind of reality?
We're living at a time at the moment where people are really confused. You know, the debate that we've talked about that you don't like existing is so loud and polarized and confusing.
Everyone's assigned a gender at birth. You also have a biological sex in the fact that, you know, you have a penis, or you're born with female chromosomes, or you're born with intersex chromosomes or whatever. But you are assigned a gender as well. You know, how weird is it that we do gender reveal parties, and, you know, before the kid's even born, once we see that they have a penis, we go, great, you're going to be raised as a man. We don't know what their gender is going to be. I mean, that's the problem. However, I have been doing a lot of reading about, like...
So you think biological sex is real and gender is different?
Well, what I mean by biological sex is real is, I think it's real in the fact that you're born with a set of chromosomes, but I don't think that is at all defining of what your gender is, or has any real bearing on what your gender could be. But if we want to do the biology conversation, I was speaking to a scientist the other day who was like, if you really want to go into it, biological essentialism just falls apart, because there are some men who have way more estrogen than some cis men who have way more estrogen than some cis women. There are some cis women who literally have the hormonal quality of what you might think is like a normal man. Once you start to do the biological nitty-gritty, there's so little difference. And this is where I think the debate has got a little bit juvenile. It's, you've got a penis or you've got a vagina, end of.
And we're back in the room, back in the present. And this time, Glamrou joins us from home.
Hello, yes, this is my living room, kitchen.
So how has your lockdown been?
It's been okay. I live alone, so it has got quite lonely. And so much of my work is live performing, you know, drag performing sort of on stage. And that has been a real casualty of the current pandemic. I mean, we just don't know what's really going to be happening to queer venues, queer theatres. And, you know, there's a lot of us who've been trying to do sort of online drag shows, and they're fun, but just you can't replicate the power of seeing a drag performer on stage with queer people in the audience all kind of coming together. So I think for me, that's been the hardest thing about the lockdown, is not having kind of the physical queer community to feel a part of. I've been able to do some writing for work from home, which hasn't really changed. And I've got a puppy, but I've given him to my dog walker today just because he's so needy.
So you got a puppy during lockdown?
Well, I actually got it just before, and then lockdown happened, and he's great. I mean, I love my puppy, but it is a bit like living with an idiot.
Have you been dressing up?
You know what? I actually have been dressing up a lot. I think what's been really interesting is before Corona, I was often kind of getting in drag just for work or just for gigs or interviews and that kind of stuff. And I'd kind of forgotten a little bit how much drag, definitely like earlier on in my kind of career journey, was just about sort of expressing my true self. It's funny because a big criticism that I hear from people who are maybe homophobic or transphobic is that like, you just dress up for attention or whatever. And actually I've really discovered during lockdown that I'm sort of dressing up for myself a lot of the time.
We've all gone a bit bonkers during lockdown, haven't we? I mean, so how's your mental health been?
My mental health has not been great at points. And I noticed a real low point when my phone was on the couch with my dog and I just said, hey, can you pass my phone, please? And then realized I was talking to my dog and that I'd had no human interaction in about 6 weeks. So that was like a real low point. I mean, for me, the thing that's been hard has been the lack of kind of community and physical space. And it's interesting, obviously, like lockdown also being in place during Pride, because like for me a great way out of like mental health spirals is to just sort of go to a drag bar and just be around other queer people and watch a drag show, and not having that kind of physical space in which to sort of have a kind of queer communion has made me feel really, really lonely. But I've also tried to use lockdown like as an opportunity to kind of fix a lot of those bad habits as much as I can, and doing things for pleasure and not just work has been a thing that I've actually found to be a kind of unexpected benefit of lockdown, because, you know, screenwriting or doing drag are things that I'm luckily enough have been able to make money from and make my career. But as a result, I was only ever kind of doing them for deadlines and for work. And I've been able to use the time when I've had it and money has been okay to just sort of write for pleasure and not worry about sending it to anyone, or do drag for myself. So I've actually like found the joy in what I do.
And I mean, as somebody who's had OCD, I mean, I know people who have found lockdown very, very hard in that respect, and that it's exacerbated OCD.
Yeah.
And other people who've been able to sort of just keep it at bay, and sort of it's been irrelevant. I just wondered what your perspective on it was.
It's really come in peaks and troughs, I have to say. I mean, I don't want to like sugar. Some of it has been extraordinarily bad, because what like an OCD brain tends to do is it will find an event or anything to ruminate over. And that was happening a lot, you know, in my old life, by just sort of, you know, I would go to a meeting and then afterwards my OCD would, you know, replay the meeting over and over and over again. And then I would be like, oh my God, that was the worst meeting ever. I'm sure I offended that person and their entire family. I've got to send a bouquet of flowers. And then I would do that. But I've not been having those interactions to stimulate that. So what I've been finding is that like random stuff from the past just comes out, like remembering that guy who dumped me 3 years ago and being like, why did that happen? And kind of going over it and over it in my head. So it's almost just like my brain having nowhere else to go besides past memories, which has been pretty unpleasant. This is why I'm so grateful to have a dog, because what the dog has been able to do is, instead of sort of lying in the morning kind of ruminating over old events, I just have to take him out so he can go to the toilet. I have to take him out twice a day for a walk. So actually having that to just give me some activity has been really beneficial.
One of the things that's really kind of blown up since we last spoke is an argument around JK Rowling and what she recently said.
Yes.
Now let me just read what she wrote so that we can sort of talk about this in the full context. She said, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. The idea that women like me, who've been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences is a nonsense. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I do not believe it's hateful to say so. So what do you think?
So I have to say, my mental health really did take a toll when that was all going on. There's so much to kind of deconstruct there, but I'll try and do it sort of methodically as I can. I think the first thing to say when that statement came out was how out of touch it felt with the broader and global cultural kind of reckoning we're having at the moment with white supremacy and Black Lives Matter, and really trying to understand like why Western societies have become as sort of structurally prejudicial as they are. And to see a sort of white cis billionaire focus her energy on such a tiny minority of people, to me was breathtakingly short-sighted. And so to like attack her claims kind of head on, I think what people often miss in terms of the trans conversation is it's pitched as this sort of war between trans people and cis people. Now, trans people estimated to be between 0.3%, 0.6% to maybe 1% of the entire population. So this kind of idea that JK Rowling is peddling, that trans people are going to erase the idea of sex completely, is a complete fabrication, because that would not be possible with the numbers that we're talking, right? It's such a tiny minority of people. It's a common mythology that trans people are trying to erase the idea of sex. They're just expanding it, in my view. They're just telling us that actually, yes, there are definitely lived realities that come with what biological organs you're given, but trans people just have a gender identity that is variant from the sex they were assigned at birth. What really upsets me about this is trans people are essentially victims of the same systems of oppression that JK Rowling claims to be fighting in that claim. So what I think really upset me in her claim was she later went to talk about her own domestic abuse experience, and she has my complete sort of sympathies and empathies. But trans people are just as likely or even more likely to be victims of domestic abuse. And I found her sort of cloaking of her transphobia within a story about domestic abuse to be one in bad faith, because there was no argument that trans people were going to be the perpetrators of that domestic abuse. That's the assumption.
I mean, you say cloaking her transphobia. She's clearly trying to say, or clearly saying, she's not transphobic, that she doesn't hate trans anything. So why do you think it's transphobic, what she's saying?
The reason I call it transphobia, and I kind of draw attention to the word phobia, is it's all based on fear or ideas, and it's not based on any actual factual evidence. So that to me is a phobia, because it's an interpretation of a feeling which then informs an idea of how you feel like a society should be run. Most transphobic journalism is all based, or transphobic thinking is all based on these hypothetical as-ifs of, well, if trans people can say I'm a woman even though I have a penis, and then surely all cis men could do the same, and therefore isn't this a problem? It's all based on this kind of hypothetical extrapolation of an argument without any awareness of the detail of what actually goes on. So the reason I say it's transphobic is like, actually trans women have been able to enter single female sex spaces for years now. That's actually been going on, and much of the discourse is, well, what would happen if a trans woman did enter a single sex space? And guess what? Nothing bad has happened.
And as things stand, trans women who have penises do enter female toilets and nobody knows.
And nothing's happened.
And nothing happens.
And nothing's happened. And it really saddened me because I feel like the right or the patriarchy wins when particularly British feminists are punching down so vigorously at trans women who, 81% of trans women last year experienced harassment. 2 out of 5 trans people have contemplated suicide. About 50% of all trans women are victims of domestic abuse. I mean, the statistics are so harrowing. And to punch down at such a kind of defenseless minority when there are much, much bigger issues at play seems to be what upsets me the most. It's such a waste of political oxygen for feminists, and some of them very intelligent feminists, to be zeroing in on a hypothetical situation that might be perpetrated by 0.3 or 0.6% of the population.
But that view,
rather than looking...
that view, sorry to interrupt, I mean, that view does seem to, I don't know whether it's gathering pace, but it's certainly one that is expressed more and more, it seems. And so
Yeah.
I wonder how, and there's lots of, well-respected, as you say, feminists or just, other commentators and journalists who are on the JK Rowling side, effectively, of this argument. So how are you going to take on that argument? How do you think, this is a sort of a change the world battle, isn't it? So how are you going to change the world on this one?
I would always encourage anyone who has fears of trans people coming into spaces to look bluntly at the facts. And I think this is where media has a lot to answer for in terms of just relaying what are the facts of how many trans people there are in the world, how much violence has happened because of trans people, because the statistics will just demystify the entire argument. Now, obviously, this is also based on emotion. And so this is where I think storytelling is going to be really, really key. I think and I think the reason this has become so toxic is that the transgender kind of conversation has become a debate online. And what we see happening is trans people constantly being invited on TV or whatever to debate the idea of being trans and never being allowed to just express the lived realities of their lives. And this is where I think, like, if there were some more TV characters or film characters that just show the everyday realities of a trans woman, then hopefully people's empathy to their experience will build. Because I think it's something like 80% of the population have never met a trans person, which is unsurprising given that there are so few, right? And so a lot of these conversations are happening in echo chambers where there's no conversation with the other side. Now, what happens is, this is what really stresses me out, is when trans people say, actually, no, we don't agree with your side of the argument, a lot of women, cis women, say, well, you're silencing women. But it's really hard to expect trans people to enter a conversation when what's up for debate is their right to even be having that conversation or to be able to be in that room. So, which is why I think going forward, I might be like slowly taking myself offline and putting a lot of my energy into my TV writing and writing characters that might hope to build empathy rather than seeing trans people as an ideology. And this is where I think the real issue is trans people have been turned into an ideology by a lot of these British feminists with no realization that they're actually just real people on the ground. It's trans ideology is this, trans ideology is that, and there's no conversation with trans people. So interestingly, I was in America in January, and actually America doesn't as badly have this problem. On the left, in the British left, there's a lot of transphobia, whereas in America, broadly speaking, in the left, transphobia just is not a thing that's experienced as much. And I was talking to some friends out there about why this was the case. And feminism out in America, because of a real cultural awareness there is of slavery, has always had intersectionality. So kind of the awareness that different social issues are all integrated as part of their feminism, because, the women's rights and then the rights for racial equality were quite kind of synonymous in America. So there's always been an awareness of looking at an issue in parallel with how it affects different social groups. What I've noticed in Britain is, because we've had no real conversation about colonialism, I mean, most people don't even really think it was a bad thing. A lot of the feminists that we're talking about have actively said on the record, ooh, maybe we shouldn't be talking about race when we're talking about gender, because it might dilute the gender conversation. Actually, Reni Eddo-Lodge quotes one of them in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, in her section of feminism. So I think the reason it's happening in the UK is there's been a hesitancy to incorporate intersectional thinking into feminism. And I think if you look at the culprits, so a lot of white, cisgender, powerful women, I think they want to maintain their positions of power. And so punching down is much easier than punching up, because the system that helps them have positions of power are ones that ultimately harm trans people. And I don't think it's a surprise that the majority of the governments in the world that are implementing transphobic legislation are right-wing. And I always think that with these British feminists, they're aligning themselves with a lot of governments who are actually anti-choice. Like, the transphobic legislation that's coming out of America right now is coming from an administration that wants to ban abortion rights. And yet they seem to align themselves with a lot of these British feminists. So I think it's just like an enmeshment with their politics, and it's about maintaining power, in my view. I'm sure I'm going to get trolled to pieces for saying that.
No, I don't know about that. I hope not, because it's a really intelligent analysis. And you take us naturally into what's happened since George Floyd's killing in America, right. And the whole conversation around colonialism and slavery, and the reckoning that, well, I don't know whether it's happening or not. A couple of weeks ago, I thought it was. I'm not so sure anymore.
Yeah, we don't know. Do you think it's happening?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think I think it may be dying down quicker than we thought, because I think this is a conversation a lot of people just don't want to have.
This is what I worry about as well. And, I mean, I did actually think it was hilarious that 2 days into Black Lives Matter, everyone thought, you know what we need to do on Instagram? A black square and have a day of silence. I was like, you don't get a day of silence. This is 2 days in. But I think the uncomfort comes from releasing some of your power, right? I mean, that's the real thing that's being asked of a lot of people with privilege. It's, if you really care about addressing this and almost paying reparations, you have to relinquish some of your power. And I think that is why the JK Rowling moment in the context of Black Lives Matter really, really upset me, because it was like, instead of attacking a system that you are benefiting from as a sort of billionaire and as someone who's kind of white and cisgender, you've decided to construct a monster out of something that's not really there. And in terms of colonialism, I really, 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 really hope Britain starts to think about colonialism properly. I actually think period dramas have been really problematically responsible for kind of these national myths of like a once white nation, because I've been actually doing a lot of research during this lockdown of transgender identities during Georgian England and during like the Regency period. And there was loads of molly houses where loads of trans people kind of lived quite peacefully until some Enlightenment values came to kind of come for them. But there is a rich trans history in the UK and all around the world. And actually colonialism is responsible not only for racial supremacy, but for this insistence on biological sex. So if you think about like India, the Hijra community prior to colonialism were incredibly well respected in India. They were actually had really amazing jobs.
We should just say what the Hijra community is. Hijras are eunuchs, basically, who go around performing at weddings and auspicious occasions and things like that.
Yeah, and the kind of Indian third gender. But when you look at the history of them in India, like a lot of them were very sort of deified once upon a time. And when British colonialists came in, they brought with them colonial laws that kind of basically made that sort of behavior illegal. And that is still and that's only been recently rescinded in India, that law. So like if you trace back colonial history, what you'll find is ideas of racial supremacy and eugenics coming hand in hand with kind of an insistence on biological sex as finite.
Just lastly on this topic, I mean, in terms of racism, sort of head-on racism, do you think this period is making us a more or less racist country?
I'm going to be an optimist right now. I've never seen this, like this level of conversation from every kind of industry and every. So I think I do think it's making everyone aware of racism and how it manifests. I'm going to say that obviously there's going to be the sort of reactionary right who maybe become more racist in their response to what's going on. But there's this line in Angels in America, which I always try and go back to, which is about like painful progress. And I feel like that's sort of what's happening at the moment. There is a kind of painful progress, and I'm gonna be optimistic on that one. I'm not that much of a nihilist.
Well, finally, I mean, obviously I've asked you this before, but I think I should ask you again and see how different the answers are. If you could just change the world any way you wanted, how would you do it? Shall I tell you what you said last time, roughly?
Yes, please.
It was celebrate yourself and your own vulnerability, swapping a patriarchal society for a matriarchal one.
A quite like small pragmatic thing that I think would actually be very beneficial in the long run. I would make it, I would try and move away from conversations about minorities and race and trans people as debates. And I would like to see a world where instead of debating identities, we allowed identities to just tell their own stories in a non-polemical way. I think part of the reason things have got so toxic, particularly around people who are trans, is pretty much every single representation I've seen has been a debate. You have someone who is scared of trans people and then a trans person in the defensive, and it makes the trans person become quite shouty because they're just defending their right to exist, and it becomes this shouting match. And I would like to see, I'm sure a lot of sort of free speech people are going to come for me, but I would like to move away from thinking about human beings as a debate and hearing their stories, because I think that will help build a more empathetic society where we don't question people's rights as much as try and understand them.
Glamrou, thank you very much indeed for joining us again.
Thank you.
And for sharing your way to change the world. Another fascinating conversation.
Oh, no, always lovely to speak to you.
I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review. All of these interviews are viewable on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Nina Hodgson. Until next time, bye-bye.